Robots, cabbage, poison your food order. Robots, cabbage, poison your food order. Robots are great. They distract you from the fact that in China, life just sucks. In Chinese cabbage, big, juicy, flavorful in any broth. After this video, you should never touch it if the market label says it is from China. And poison your food delivery orders because revenge against society is never ending in that country. Just months after we talked about bayberries, a popular snack fruit that's soaked in chemicals, we now have the white cabbage scandal. An environmental curator investigated a large cabbage export town using formaldehyde, which is the stuff that's used to embalm a body to preserve the freshness of the leaves. On August 22nd, a video titled Exposing Formaldehyde Cabbage claimed to have visited Hebei's Zhangjiakou, a major production area for domestic Chinese cabbage, and he went to investigate local planting, harvesting, and transportation conditions. The video shows multiple transport vehicles parked in the cabbage planting area, large quantities of harvested veggies waiting to be loaded, and on-site workers were captured applying a dipping treatment to some of the cabbage awaiting transport, and containers suspected to hold formaldehyde solution also appeared in the footage. Now, formaldehyde liquid was found also near multiple transport vehicles, which means immediately before they're loaded onto the truck, something happens to it, right? Now, my immediate thought was like, oh, since we're now hearing about the investigation into cabbage, that probably means that cabbage at the moment is the safest food to consume in China, since the vendors aren't putting things in at the moment, fear that they'll also be investigated. All the other food options, I don't know. I'm joking, by the way, but if you're a regular viewer, you know that this is not something new. Formaldehyde soaking in China is just simply not a new thing. What they've been doing, or what makes this so serious, is the fact that Chinese cabbage is a very common household consumption. It's a staple. Northeastern cuisines runs on it, right? Pork and cabbage dumplings also use it. It's used in hot pot. It's used in soups. It's like if your broccoli were bad, or chemically festered with, I don't know what's in those. But the point is, the transport workers in the video started this argument and basically were deflecting and kind of saying that this is a common practice, like they're used to it. And this batch was heading to a farmer's market down in south in Jiangsu province. So that transportation is a route that they're doing, which seems to be a regular thing. Now, clearly accountability is already out of the picture because by the time you're actually seeing something in this that's systemic, that's in some part, I would say locally incentivized from officials because it earns them money or it's somewhat profitable, accountability is already out of the window. Back in 2022, Chinese state media, CCTV, had called this so-called formaldehyde cabbage a foreign forces attack or a misinformation campaign in an attempt to sabotage Chinese society or the harmony of Chinese society. Meanwhile, it's widely consumed domestically. So, by the way, this news is not new, right? So back in around 2012, there was already a report of people investigating formaldehyde-soaked cabbage. So it's been more than a decade. And guess how many people have already ate that? And neighboring countries, they also import this too, right? Korea, they're now investigating the cabbage's chemical content. The same people who ran the milk formula poisoning back in like the early 2000s that left babies with giant heads or just permanent problems, they've now moved on to this next product. People that are carrying the profit over safety, the lack of moral values, they literally think that this is something that they can get because it makes them a little bit more profit, that they're willing to screw other people over. Now, clearly, you have people excusing this, right? Or they're calling this a singular case. On August 22nd, in the Hebei Zhangjiakou police investigation, they've already seized more than 10 barrels of the formaldehyde from that particular video. And sure, now it sounds like police is involved, which means that accountability is back, right? Well, it's not. It's never. Because people will point out that this story has been around for more than a decade, and yet it takes them more than a decade to find a single location that has this problem. By the way, that article back in 2012 was saying something that happened in 2007, 2008. So this is earlier than almost 2 decades of the documented case of this particular formaldehyde problem. And when they interviewed a bunch of people, they basically found that everybody has been using this preservation method for a while, because what takes them more than a decade to learn is apparently just 10 barrels of chemicals.
去上那个苹果园，你去整一下，那苹果那些药，那你得上那地上啊，那都，那地比这严都不严。那大米，咱出吃蔬菜哪样没搁那农药？
就是离家远，离家近，买点回去。
That speaks to the lack of accountability, or the responsibility on this somehow lands on citizens and journalists to expose rather than government systems and officials. Now, another one of this, rice, which is widely assumed in Asia, especially in China. Anti-counterfeiting investigator Liu Jiang says that in tests, they found so-called organic labeled rice sold at HelloFresh, which is a chain grocery store, and Metro, another store chain, including Hema's organic glutinous rice and several Metro Select organic rice lines. They all contain synthetic pesticides like tricyclazole and tebuconazole, which are banned under China's organic standards GBT 19630 2019. But despite them carrying the certification and the premium pricing, they still contain the same pesticides. Other veggies are also soaked before they're sold out. And fish, a similar story of using formaldehyde to preserve the freshness.
我也是触目惊心呐！
好，我们现在把这个带鱼放在甲醛里面，让它泡一会儿，然后一会儿和这个没有泡过甲醛的带鱼做个对比，
邦邦硬呐！
这个没有泡过甲醛的鱼，它的鱼肉是非常有弹性的哈。你用手指这样一按，它能按一个坑哈。
反观这个泡过甲醛的带鱼，鱼肉邦邦硬。
你看，我用很大的力气都没按到一个坑，怎么样？
没泡甲醛的带鱼，鱼身是比较柔软的，可以随意的弯曲；泡过甲醛的带鱼，鱼肉比较硬，
它是弯不下去的，它邦邦硬的。
一下油锅就会开发，没有泡过的形状就会比较完整。大家结合。
The usual deflection when you see comments online is like this, right? Oh, does soaking in formaldehyde cost nothing? Fresh cabbage pulled straight from the field only costs a few cents. Why would farmers and sellers and transportation companies take the extra time and effort and the money to poison you? Like, that doesn't make sense. It turns out they really do spend the extra time to do that. A Chinese language media recently published the economic calculus behind the formaldehyde cabbage. And the report points out that transporting a truckload of 30 tons of cabbage from that route that they seized the chemical from cost around 7,600 yuan with an ordinary truck. But if you switch that to a refrigerated truck, that fee jumps to about 12,000 yuan, which is a 60% increase just in transportation costs. So adding onto a few cents for the formaldehyde soaking, that cuts down that 60% dramatically because you don't need to use a refrigeration truck anymore. Wholesale cabbage trading is already tiny, like very thin in terms of the margin to begin with for profit. A 2020 survey showed that the average net profit margin for 5 types of vegetables in the wholesale link was only about 3.4%. And previous documented case for cabbage, the wholesaling part, the actual profit after deducting everything like transportation, labor, packaging, processing, market fees, it was only about 7 cents yuan, not 7 cents per dollar, right? So it's like 1 cent basically. A proper cold chain in China also, you're required by law to not just have refrigeration, but you also need to have, a cold storage facility, electricity, pre-cool, like all sorts of things attached to that. So when you don't even have the profit to, generate, to buy any of the cold chain storage process, your best bet is to simply say that, look, let's just cut down the cost, use the extra cost that we need to have on something that does everything by just simply dipping it into a bucket. Who wouldn't want to do that, right? Well, normally in a country that has food and ethics standards, they wouldn't even begin to think to do that because the extra cost means you save lives. But in China, because there is no moral restrictions, you can pretty much do whatever you want. We've also seen something similar in the past few years where they used industrial oil or petroleum transportation tanks to transport cooking oil. Or they had the bayberry case that we previously talked about, where we have this now, the formaldehyde cabbage incident. The violations, the food safety scandals that you see, they all share a very similar profit-driven logic. Compliance with transportation and preservation standards is prohibitively expensive, right? But the cost of illegally adding cheap chemical is negligible. So the same mouthpiece that now turns to this excuse afterwards, after these scandals come out, is that, oh, look, if you don't do it this way, the transport cost is too much. On regulation standards, once they tighten up, prices are going to skyrocket. Nobody can afford to buy these things. Folks out there, they're barely scraping by. And that's why these people did this, right? To excuse that. Okay, so we talk about how does a corrupt system actually look? How does it manifest, Okay, relying solely on testing to ensure food safety is met. That's simply unrealistic in China because it requires standardized ethics being applied equally with no corruption, which is simply not the case in a low-trust society. Normally, you wouldn't think twice to buy something off the shelf in a supermarket. Now in China, you have to Google whether or not there was a scandal attached to this, right? If you really want to confirm its, safety through testing from heavy metals, pesticides, residuals, chemicals, all sorts of preservatives and illegal stuff, right? It would involve dozens of tests. All that money is one thing, time is another thing, but it's just like nobody really does it. It only covers a limited number of items. And what about things that they use after those testings are done? And you're also really only getting the limited samples, right? And they find ways to just send in a batch of clean testing sample to you. Meanwhile, the mass exported ones are still being soaked in whatever, right? So now the only thing that's keeping this in check are these people that are exposing it, journalists or media. And then those that get censored, well, that basically turns the whole story into a dead end immediately after it's been exposed. So there's no further actions needed from the government's perspective. Now, because I always hear this from Chinese people that are older to say that, anything that happens with food, right, it doesn't really matter or impact the CCP officials because those people are eating fresh, clean, organic products that are ensured to the highest safety standards, or maybe imported from Japan or the US or wherever else, Europe, right? They don't have to deal with the food safety stuff, so it doesn't matter to them. So this is why the value of morality, conscience, and press freedom is so important, which are all the things that lacks they don't have in China. Silencing people and then accusing them of having ulterior motives is you're missing the point, right? This is about people's safety. So you can't expect to have widespread moral governance in a country that's decaying. And so it's essentially saying you got to have table manners while you're eating each other alive. When you question food safety issues, you're always told that they've tested everything, it's safe, but what they don't tell you is that the entire industry is still cannibalistic, only a tiny fraction can be exposed, and testing covers only a small portion of the risks and the batches. A similar story broke days later on August 24th. A company in Fujian province, down in the south, was exposed for long-term use of highly toxic pesticide dichlorobus to provide disinfection and pest control services to dozens of chain catering companies. And this was described as a poisoning-style operations, which is to cut cost again for companies that had been using cheap dichlorobus, which is a few yuan a bottle, instead of the compliant product, which runs about 4 to 5 times that per bottle. And we know that dichlorobus is a moderately to highly toxic organophosphorus insecticide, and so it's been restricted or banned in residential areas in some regions. But also don't think that poisoning people only comes from these companies or food vendors, because today in a pressure cooker environment like China, nothing's off the table when it comes to screwing others, because some people felt like they've been screwed over. And so revenge against society is very common. One delivery driver has been adding poison, or allegedly trying to drink orders, basically picking off strangers at random because he felt wronged. And another felt helpless and randomly laced thousands of orders with poison in Henan province. This is the country of your 10-minute delivery, right, to your door. At what cost? Sure, is that worth the time you're saving just, for somebody to almost trip and fall to the point where they're breaking down because they're being punished that they didn't get your delivery in time, or that they get punished for not doing 10,000 orders to make ends meet? This is genuinely terrifying, because whether the videos are real or not isn't actually the central issue. The claim alone is enough to trigger public panic, and that's what happened. A food delivery receipt already contains warning instructions on how to check micro holes or injection points, and checking the drink colors prior to consumption. And this really fits the psychology of a desperate victim trying to force society to pay attention, right? He may not want to be the one that kills people, or he may have already done this. It's very easy to hide that in China, because any story they don't want you to hear, no matter how big the death count, they can do it. But it's fear to force resolution of his grievances, right? And it would explain why he filmed himself and posted it. The goal was attention, not mass murder. But if he did do this, it means that it's gotten so desperate. And also, even if he didn't do it, who guarantees that somebody else would not do this? If someone else feels the same way, being crushed under the same system, at the end of the day, it's like an inaction from the CCP, or the active mismanagement. They've driven an unknown number of people to this kind of extreme self-sacrificial cycle at the bottom of society. We've seen this pattern before. And to be clear, debts have debtors, right? Go after the person that's responsible. Why are you targeting innocent people who've likely suffered just the same under that same system? And you're turning on your own solves nothing, really. But this kind of incident, they keep recurring, because across Chinese society, a dead end with no fix, anyone to the CCP is expendable. And it's really funny, because I think this one you have to blame Xi Jinping for it, right? Because since he came into power, it's all about telling the China story well. It's all about building a mirage. And this is the side of the mirage. We have the story that dominated this week in China, which is the robot Olympics equivalent, or the robot competition, right? You look at this side of China compared to the bleak first half that we talked about. World humanoid robot games just held in Beijing. You see clips of these cool-looking robots, running, competing, boxing, jumping, doing all sorts of things, shattering human records in all sports. A lot of people came away impressed. But this event has already triggered massive controversy. Some say that the whole thing is just theater. Again, it's flashy with no practical value. Entertainment. It's no different from robots doing backflips in the Chinese New Year Gala. It's pure emotional value, nothing more. Some other people also say that this marks the dawn of a CCP robot-dominated era. The Chinese AI robotics has already blown past the United States by a mile, making the country that's awesome, awesome again. Well, after the game opened on Saturday, August 22nd at the Beijing's National Speed Skating Oval, this 5-day event is closing now, but there were 666 teams from 16 countries that attended. About 40% of the competition had required full autonomy from the robots, and China fielded the overwhelming majority, which is 641 teams, about 1,975 robots. And there were also other countries like Germany, Brazil, US, Japan that also joined as well. Now, the headline was obviously a robot from Team Tianzhou that ran about 100 meters in 9.39 seconds, which is beating the human world record of 9.58. And there's also another robot that jumped 2.88 meters from a dead stop, which is a height that no human will probably ever clear. But the moment that actually broke the internet was Tiangong's robot, Omni, which won the 400 meters with a bizarre gait, which is dubbed the face-covering robot or the girl-running robot. It basically ran with two hands with like both arms in front of the face, as if she's like running away from some pursuers or something like that. Many noticed that how it just ran like an anime girl would run. Again, there's a lot of speculations. The idea that maybe the engineering team was led by some anime lovers or something like that. They were trying to motion capture a female stride and then programmed it. But apparently that's not what happened. But if you look closely at many of the footage, there's always somebody standing next to the robot with a controller in hand, and it's tracking every step along the way. And the 100-meter obstacle course, the ball game, the combat sports, they're all the same story throughout. They're human operated across the board. Essentially, you're not autonomous in the sense like they can do this themselves. They're still being controlled. And these robots, they can't be on the production line. You still need to hire a worker or a controller behind them to control the robots to do the things that you want them to do. So the performance leap from last year is real and visible, but there are so many limits still. The practical use case remains thin. Like in the weightlifting one, the robot barely got a tiny barbell halfway through and just collapsed. So where can you apply this to the industrial scale of heavy lifting? Well, nowhere. Autonomy and generalization, they're still the biggest problems, and most Chinese robots are running on task-specific instructions, which are preloaded with one scenario, and they cost a lot too. And if you change the scenario, then the robot is lost. It malfunctions and has no idea what to do. And I think that's really where the second part of the story, I think, answers itself, right? Dazzling on stage, dependent on a person to do, distraction provided to look elsewhere for what's happening in the Chinese society. Oh yeah, and they want you to forget the misery that's happening to the real folks who are going through it, because robots have no feelings, but people do. Thank you very much for watching this episode. Hope you enjoyed the content. Let me know your thoughts in the comment below. And did you enjoy the robots doing their thing? Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.